Ashley Honsberger. I'm the Executive Director for Poultry Industry Council. We're pleased to be hosting this series in partnership with OMAFRA. So OMAFRA is the Ontario Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Rural Affairs. And they've provided us some funding, for hosting this series as we go through the avian influenza situation in Ontario. So this series is targeted specifically for small flock stakeholders across the province. So we were having a think about what's going on right now. So we consider this series of webinars as a continued conversation. Things are happening every single day in the province with this issue. And now it's come upon us that maybe we need to start talking more broadly beyond what's happening with the poultry or with the different birds specifically, and how else other areas of our life might be impacted. And that's when we came up with this notion of One Health, which is nothing new. It's been around for a long time, but it kind of helps us take a step back and say, how can we look more holistically at the situation, and how can we make sure that other parts of the ecosystem are maintaining safe practices. So the One Health concept just quickly looks at the environmental health, including plants, looks at animal health, and then it looks at human health and how all of those things interact. And specifically why we bring this up in the context of avian influenza is because of the notion of zoonotic diseases. So you can see here, just a quick refresher, a zoonotic disease is an infectious disease that's transmitted between species from animals to humans or vice versa. And this I pulled from a veterinary medicine website, and it's a little bit of complicated language, but I thought it was helpful because it sort of puts some context around how One Health plays out in the avian influenza situation we find ourselves in. And you can see right there in the center that zoonoses are named. So right along with veterinary medicine and human medicine, it's something that we need to start thinking about. So I know last Thursday, I unfortunately missed out on the session, but Charlotte shared this slide for those of you who were on at that time. So there's a ton of different organizations at the table at this point in time to make sure the small flock stakeholders have all of the resources they need. And now we've added this new circle here through the Ministry of Health, and we've actually got one of our MOH partners on the line tonight. And just to quickly introduce the roster, we've got Greg Robinson from CFIA, Dr. Luci and Al Dam from OMAFRA. Emily Martin's joined us to talk a little bit about exotic birds and other things. Heather McClinchey's joining us from the Ministry of Health. We've got Dr. Brian Stevens on the line. He's fielding a lot of calls from across the province about different birds in the wildlife setting. And then of course, you've got myself and Charlotte on the line as well. And for those of you who haven't been on previously, we tend to share a lot of resources, a lot of links. We talk about the maps and all the ongoing information where you can sign up for listservs. We put that all in one location on our website, poultryindustrycouncil.ca, and it's under this biosecurity and disease tab. So we're trying to just create a whole pile of resources there to make it easy for you to access that information that you need. We also learned today that the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association has a very timely workshop on biosecurity. So it's a 2-hour session. There's 2 different ones, April 19th and 26th. Both are free to attend. So again, we're going to put that registration information up on the PIC website. Otherwise, you can just Google it through the OSCIA website as well. And if you missed any of our previous recordings, I welcome you to check them out on our YouTube channel. All of these sessions are being recorded. The most timely one is up on our website, and then the rest of them are here on our YouTube channel. So that's all I've got for now to kick it off, and I'm going to invite Al Dam to come on and get us going here.
Ashley, so we're here today. I feel like I'm saying grace. We're going to give a bit of an update today on from Greg Robinson from CFIA. So he's going to give sort of the CFI situational update. Dr. Luci is going to talk to us today about something I'm sure that everyone's interested in, which is that minister's order that got put out last Friday afternoon. That is in effect now. And then we'll just pretty much then open it up to various questions. I think Brian Stevens has a couple of, he wants to talk for a minute or two about submissions into CWHC, because we have a lot of inquiries about songbirds and what to submit. So you can verify with us with that, and then yeah, we'll open up to questions. So at that, we will start. So if Greg can come on, we'll get him to give his update.
Hey, thanks, Sal. And thanks for the opportunity for this continued story in terms of the AI response. So I'll try and pick things up as best I can from when we last talked last Thursday. Since then, we have included 2 additional sites in South Glengarry on the website. As well, we are currently in the process of confirming additional sites in West Grey Township and also a 3rd site in Markham. So as you can see, we continue to see pop up of additional sites as the days go by. The website has been updated to include primary control zones for the first 12 sites. So for those of you that might be new to the terminology, the primary control zone is our response action, and it controls movements of poultry and poultry products in, out, and through the zones with permitting. The website map is interactive. It allows you to put in your address, and it will drop an X into the map to allow you to see if you are in the zone or not. I'll draw attention to the infected zone within the maps. The infected zone is an important zone as it defines the restricted area for movement of live poultry. As the disease moves forward, consideration can be given for the movement of live birds in those infected zones, but at this point in all 12 zones, live bird movement is prohibited within those infected zones. If when you're using the interactive map, you're not sure exactly which zone you might fit in or not, there is also a movements control line and email address that you can use to confirm which zone you are or not. The website also contains a list of activities in a table, as well as definitions for the different zones. So hopefully that helps to determine which type of permit might be required. It's being continually updated to try and provide additional clarity based on feedback. So we're trying to ever make it easier to understand and be updated. At this point too, we're making the strong reminder that avian influenza is spreading across the globe. At this point, we're certainly seeing lots of action. So anyone with farm animals must practice good biosecurity habits to protect poultry and prevent disease. There is some resources also on the website that I'll highlight that are designed specifically for producers and owners of backyard flocks and pet birds. So I'll put the website address into the chat here when I'm done and throughout the discussion. But there's 4 links and documents available. There's 5 rules to prevent and detect disease in backyard flocks and pet birds. We have a protect your flock from bird flu, a general producer guide on farm biosecurity standards, and then a national avian on-farm biosecurity standard. So lots of good information there for backyard flocks and some real detailed information on biosecurity if you're interested. To give an update on some things that are happening in the rest of the country, since we last talked, Alberta has seen 7 confirmed cases and they continue to follow up on some other high risks. So lots going on out west. Quebec is also involved in at least 1 high-risk premise as well. And that's on top of the already confirmed cases that were earlier this spring in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. So ultimately seeing response actions almost across the country. That's my update for today in terms of that continued story, and happy to answer questions either at the end or however you want to. Yeah, I'm not sure how you're managing them today, Ashley.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention we're going to hold the questions off to the end just so that we can kind of jam pack that part of our day. Thanks very much, Greg, though. So now we're going to invite Dr. Luci Rosca from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I will provide you some information with regards to the OMAFRA Minister Order that is aimed at limiting the commingling the birds from different locations in order to reduce the risk of transmission of H5N1 avian influenza virus. There are two animal health acts that they are covering Ontario. The one is federal, that is related to diseased farm animals, is taking care about that. And the provincial one that is taking care about the healthy farmed animals. While the CFIA has the primary responsibility for managing the detection, containment, and response to avian influenza on the infected premises in Ontario, there are actions that should be taken under the authority of the province's Animal Health Act 2009 to further investigate and mitigate the risk of disease spread from premise to premise. Wild bird surveillance demonstrated that avian influenza H5N1 is everywhere in Ontario. Some birds may not exhibit clinical signs, and as the incubation period is up to 14 days, birds that appear healthy can be infected and can transmit avian influenza to other birds. Section 2460 and 24.7 of the Animal Health Act for Ontario set out the restrictions and requirements that are considered necessary to prevent the spread of disease. Effectively, April 9th, the movement into participation of birds in events where they commingle, such as shows, sales, swaps, fairs, sport, and educational displays, is prohibited. This is in addition to Canadian Food Inspection Agency requirements in primary control zone. This order is temporary and will expire on May the 9th, however, may be extended if required. As a note, the Animal Health Act was not used prior to set up any orders. So you can imagine how serious the problem is with this avian influenza in Ontario. The purpose for the order is to prevent, detect, control, suppress, or mitigate the highly pathogenic avian influenza by requiring the prohibition of certain commingling events in Ontario. And there are some reasons for that order that has been issued. The recommendation was based on confirmed cases of highly pathogenic avian influenza in domestic poultry in Ontario, as well as the increase in high-risk investigations. The Chief Veterinarian of Ontario has recommended the establishment of animal health control area in the whole of Ontario, effectively, immediately. And what the affected birds are part of this, they're all known bird species, raised for food display or pets, used for sport protection, commercial and non-commercial poultry, zoological and other display poultry, housed at wildlife rehabilitation facilities, and personal pet species. On the same slide, you do have a website that you can get access to get more information about this order. And probably we're going to put that on the with the discussion with our presentation today. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. So as I mentioned, in the bottom center of the screen, there's that Q&A function that you're welcome to pop your questions in there, and we'll get to them at the end of our speakers. Okay, sorry, that's Dr. Brian Stevens from sorry, you were cut off there.
Perfect, thank you. So I just want to reiterate what specimens we're looking for when it comes to submitting wildlife for testing. In general, water birds, raptors, and corvids such as crows and ravens are the main species we're looking at. When it comes to songbirds, because they are not as severely affected by this virus as far as we've seen thus far, we're still looking to get them in, but typically we're bringing them in when we see more than 2 songbirds dead within a certain geographical area, and usually that's within a few hundred meters of each other. And the reason for that is that many of the songbirds that are dying, and you find them alone, they're often window strikes, so birds that have flew into windows or buildings, or there are birds that have been killed by domestic cats. So we don't want to get overwhelmed with a number of songbirds that are just trauma related. We want to focus our efforts on things like avian influenza. So if you do see a group of songbirds that have died, or if you do see songbirds that are obviously sick, so these could be songbirds that have swollen eyes, matted feathers around the face, those are the main songbirds that we're looking for at this point. Definitely, if you have questions, you can still reach out to us and inquire. But in general, I don't want to overwhelm my colleagues who are answering all these questions with too many individual songbird cases. And that's all I have to say about that for now. But if anyone has any questions, I'll definitely answer them as we go.
That's great. Thank you. So we're going to get 2 questions now. I guess everyone on our panel, if you don't mind just popping your video back on and we can see your faces as we go through these. So we have a question: as an avian veterinarian, what should I be telling my pet bird owners as far as prevalence within the pet bird population?
This is actually an interesting one because it's come up again and again since the order and even before that. So we call it avian influenza. It's not chicken influenza. It's not turkey influenza. There potentially can be a risk, but it's a function of mitigating that risk with your pets. I'm trying to remember, Greg, I think one of your veterinarians was on, we talked about what would happen if you had poultry at your farm plus, a pet parrot or something in the house that you would have to take a look at. If your flock went AI positive, they'd have to take a look at what your biosecurity measures were between your outside flock and your pet birds as to whether that would be included in a potential destruction order.
Yeah, that's right. It is one of the considerations, in terms of an infected place. It does include all poultry on the premise. So like you say, it certainly comes down to biosecurity controls and things of that nature at that time.
And I think some of the challenges or questions that we're going to get, or that you guys may have on the pet bird side, is what do I do to protect them, right? And we've already had some discussions about outside flight aviaries that some folks have. Parrots, if they're not covered, that's probably a risk. Keeping them inside, less of a risk, right? But also looking at things like if you have dogs that you have with your parrots and you're walking through the park, are they rolling in goose poop, stepping in goose poop, eating goose poop, and you bring them back into your house? Are you washing your dog's feet, making sure they're not covered in goose crap before they come in the house? Because from the wild bird side, that is a risk. So yeah, should you be concerned? Absolutely. Do you need to be freaking out? Not necessarily, but if you're doing risky activities like having birds outside, that could be something to be of concern. Luci, do you got anything to add to that?
Luci?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No.
I just see that we have someone dialing in via the phone. If you're interested in asking a question, you're welcome to push *9, and that will raise your hand, and then we can invite you to come off mute. So we just have another question, just some concern about seeing some risky behavior. So some advertising of bird selling adjacent to some of these control zones. Is there any kind of hotline anyone can call? Or a reportable line?
So really it's our movements line that control things here. The onus becomes on if the selling property is outside of the zones, then it really comes on to the person transporting the zones to either drive around the zone. So really, it's great. And I think we try to provide as much education as we can, right, to those people selling birds. And also, I think the only way to really get out ahead of this is to just spread the word as much as we can. We're using our partner organizations as much as we can. But if you are aware of those shipments that are going through, then our movement line is really the one that looks at and provides that permitting advice and permitting.
And I think if they're selling birds outside of the zone, and I've heard all sorts of folks call me and say, well, I have a biosecure site. Well, what does that mean? Right? There is no such thing as a biosecure site at the moment. With wild birds flying all over the place, unless the birds do not have outside access. And this minister's order essentially, and I hate to say the term lockdown, but it kind of is what that is, right? We want you to keep your birds away from everything, including other people that have birds or whatever, because the way this disease works, if you get this disease, you do not have birds anymore.
So that ties in well to another question that's popped up here about swans. I know Elora, for example, has a pretty prolific swan program. Should those birds be brought inside a building or a covered outdoor area? Is that sufficient?
Brian, you want to take this one because it's a kind of a wild bird question.
Kind of a wild bird. Yeah, I mean, if you want to protect them, I know that we've spoken to zoos and they're bringing all of their birds in to protect them. So if there is a concern for those swans and they are not true wild swans, but more pet swans or domestic swans or however they are kept, then bringing them indoors is probably the safest way to house them at this time.
Yeah, I see Dale Smith made a comment in the chat, and it's a good point. A lot of zoos are moving all their avian species indoors, and in some cases they're locking down their aviaries even to the public in an attempt to reduce that risk. So unless you think your biosecurity is better than a zoo, I would take a hint from them.
Okay. So just some clarification about the movement order. Does this mean we're not allowed to move any birds at all in the province? How could people transport birds at this point in time?
Because it kind of falls into the can you and should you. I can cover the can you, right? It's like ultimately as regulators, I mean, that's what the primary control zones are designed to do as regulators, is to define what movements can and cannot go. So if you're not in a primary control zone, you can move birds without a permit. I'll leave the should to some other people, right? But ultimately, it is the primary control zone that defines those zones in which restrictions are in place for movement. So there's no formal restrictions outside of those zones. If you need to move within those zones, that's where those restrictions come in.
Okay. Yeah, so there was another question about, do you need a permit to transport live birds through a control zone? And I'm hearing there's different levels of permitting that are required, and
yes,
folks are welcome to check out the CFIA website for that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just looking at it now, just, so ultimately you can look that up on the website. There's some categories that you can go through. So for live birds through the zone, the answer is if you're exporting that bird, it's prohibited to drive through the zone. That's for export to the US. And in transit for domestic, it does require specific permits. So that's where those charts can really help people to sort of answer those questions. There's then links to the permits and permitting information on there as well. So that's a good question that those charts can sort of help to answer as well, but happy to do them here as well.
Okay.
And I guess just looking at that question before we let it go, if it's outside of the zone or in relation to the order, the orders for, help me on this one, Lucy, it's commingling of birds, correct? So that's the point of, if you're bringing birds to a place where there's lots of folks, lots of other birds. So that would include things like races, like auctions, of course. I have been asked a question actually about, can you bring your birds to the vet? Was the vet considered a commingling place? I don't think it is. I'll have to get Lucy's comment on that one.
Or to take the bird to the vet, it is an exception. Yes. It's to help her if there's a problem. Yes.
And the travel restrictions, do they pertain to parrots? Do they pertain to all types of birds?
for now, they don't specify on like the species that I put the list there. So they do include all types of species, all birds. So.
Okay. So if you're in close proximity to a confirmed case or premise, are your birds going to be tested? And then what will happen?
So the close proximity is where you will land yourself into that primary control zone. So there's two parts to the primary control zone. There is the infected zone, and then there's the restricted zone. And together they make up the larger primary control zone. So proximity is sort of dependent in terms of what can happen there. Within the infected zone, that's where we prohibit the movement into the zone for live birds. And then we're permitting out in terms of live birds there. So the, what was the other question as part of that?
It was what happens, would those birds in that zone be culled or depopulated?
The only depopulated birds are those that are associated with an infected premise. So when results achieve a case definition of avian influenza, ultimately a notice of destruction is triggered, and it's just those within the infected premise. It's not a proximity piece to that one. It's only the infected premise.
Okay, that was another question that came up here. This is a bit of a longer one for Dr. Stevens. Can you provide information on how the public or municipal parks or public works staff should approach, protect themselves, and potentially handle sick or dead birds that are found? What personal protective and other health and safety protocols would you recommend they follow? And could you provide more information on what will be requested of the caller when they call to notify of a sick or a dead bird? That's a big question.
It is. And if Heather, if you're there, I may ask you to answer the PPE aspect of that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm Heather Clinchey. I'm a public health veterinarian with the Ontario Ministry of Health, and I do primarily One Health work. We have, so there's kind of two risks generally for people to be thinking of. One is the risk of handling a dead bird, and the other is handling a live bird. There's far more risk associated with handling live birds, and that constitutes the need for a lot more personal protective equipment. And it does matter what you're doing with that bird, and how in close in proximity you are going to be, and whether or not you're expecting to be sprayed with feces, or if you're going to be aerosolizing things. The second issue is if they're already dead, and that risk drops quite considerably. So we've produced at the Ontario Ministry of Health some recommendations for guidance, and I can certainly circulate that because it lays out the different scenarios and what would be required in terms of personal protective equipment. But just generally, in terms of handling a dead bird, be sensible. Wear a medical mask, N95 or KN95 if you've got it, and if you're and wear gloves as well. And good hand hygiene is really important. And if you're going to be sprayed by anything or it's wet, I would certainly put some goggles, sealed goggles on as well. Does that answer the question?
So far.
That's most of it, yes. And then the last part about what would a caller be requested to do. So that would depend on whether it's a sick or dead wild bird. With a sick bird, typically we would be notifying some other agency to hopefully be able to come out and handle it if they can. And often that involves euthanizing the bird, depending on what the illness looks like. If it is a dead wild bird, we would probably be going again for another agency to see if somebody could pick it up. But if nobody's available to pick up a dead wild bird, then we may ask the caller to pick it up, and we would recommend the same personal protective equipment that Heather just went over. But that's typically what we would do. Most of the time when somebody calls, we're going to try and dispatch somebody to get that bird if we can.
That's great. Thank you. So we're
If
just,
I could-
oh,
Sorry, if I can just jump in here as well. I just wanted to let everybody know that the Ontario Ministry of Health website is getting updated. So that should be live in a couple of days from now. And it has a really good Q&A and some links as well. So I can let everybody know when that goes live.
okay, that would be great. Yeah, we did put up we did put up a PDF. I think it's what you're describing of some practices,
Perfect.
but
Yep.
yeah, we'll definitely share that out.
Perfect.
So another question about the scale of the impact of the flu. How hard do you see this impacting game birds? This person has quail outside that live in the garden, so could potentially come into contact with the virus. So how prevalent are we thinking this situation is in the environment?
Yes, so that's a good question from Ori, and our game bird folks are definitely of concern. Was it a couple weekends ago, Brian? We saw a case in Texas of game birds. I think it was quail that tested positive. So there is risk. So yeah, so as far as what to do, that's going to be a tough one because it's going to be trying to limit quail like access of wild birds to your pen or your garden. It's can you cover some of it at least to prevent the basic things like having geese or ducks fly over and poop into the garden, because that's it's a fecal oral route for this disease when it comes to other birds. So that's going to be an issue. And then, like I said, if you have any dead wild birds outside the garden, then definitely be given WHC a call, because what species we're looking at and where they are.
And how long does the virus survive in the environment? Is there any sort of pen for meat birds that's covered that keeps wild birds out, or is it safe to finish meat birds? Is mice a vector that we should be concerned about? How open or closed can we keep this pen system?
That's going to be one of risk, right? If you can reduce the risk, what can you do to reduce the risk, right? So rodents definitely are an issue. Wild birds are an issue, like keeping migratory birds away from the pen. It's going to be something, keeping it covered so you don't have that access to ducks and geese. But if we're talking about smaller birds too, like, are you using penning that keeps smaller birds out? Are you picking up feed? So there is going to be a lot of different issues that we have to look at to reduce the risk. There's tons of information available on the CFIA website, the OMAFRA website, and on the PIC website and the ON website. Go over looking at that kind of risk.
Is there any link between avian influenza causing prolapse in laying hens?
We don't really see prolapse, we just see death. And we actually see, we also see a loss of, or drop in egg production. So I guess that's another thing of concern. Like, when do you call Greg at that number, the disease surveillance number? That's another one of the symptoms, is if we see a drop in egg production. Now, a drop in egg production from prolapse vents is not, I wouldn't consider that even influenza concern. It's if your duck flocks just stops laying eggs, or your pigeon flock stops laying eggs.
Okay. There's a question about methods of testing and sample collection for birds of any species for veterinarians. Is there any information or tutorials that have been provided? And I do think we had.
I think I can answer that one. So I'm Emily Martin. I work as a veterinary pathologist at the Animal Health Laboratory. We are in the final stages of preparing a lab note on how to sample and how to submit those samples. So it will go through your ability to get some viral transport media from the lab, or other options of the types of swabs to use to be able to take the samples, and how to submit that to the lab. So hopefully that will, we'll put that out soon, probably tomorrow or at least by the end of the week. And that should give you some information on how to take those samples.
All right, that sounds like a great resource. What is the best procedure for disposing of infected birds?
On the commercial side, we use most commonly use in barn composting is the most common way, and other options are deep burial. But I wasn't sure. I was going to answer that in the chat, but I wasn't sure if they were talking about birds or not. Of course, if you do have backyard flocks, we would ask you to call our dead bird line or our sick bird line, so that we can ultimately determine whether or not that was an avian influenza related death. But I wasn't sure if it was maybe talking about wild birds or not. So on the commercial or on the small flock side, we would want to test that, and then in barn composting and deep burial are the options that we use.
Okay. You're on mute, Al.
I know on the CFI also, if you look at some of the disposal options CFI has, they include incineration. It's really not an option in Ontario based on our dead stock regs and how, what kind of incinerator you need. You need one with an afterburner. Like we're pretty much talking a medical waste incinerator. So running a burn barrel with old motor oil and running shoes as your fuel doesn't work in this case. So yeah, I'll reiterate what Greg said. It's either composting, but if you don't have enough birds to get a compost pile to heat, because it's the heat treatment that denatures the virus, then for a small flock, deep burial might be an issue. But if that's the case, you probably want to be talking, if it's concerned about that, you probably want to be talking to CFA anyways. I'm not sure, Brian, like, what are we doing for wild birds if we see a bunch of them? I think we have Chris Sharp from CWS has been on us, but he's not with us tonight.
Yeah, I mean, definitely contact us. There's been a few questions that we've had about that, and typically we'll direct people to CWS to discuss how to dispose of groups of wild birds that have died. But yeah, definitely contact the CWHC, and we can get that information for you if you need it.
Have we seen any confirmed cases in non-bird species such as cats, dogs, or humans? And what do the symptoms look like in any non-bird species?
I can speak to the human side. There's been one confirmed case with H5N1 this year in Britain with an individual who was asymptomatic. He recovered fully with this. Generally, when we see H5N1, we see it much like flu, which right now is a little bit confusing because it could also be very COVID-like. So we're seeing things like sniffles, fever, sore throat, red eyes, could be difficulty breathing. Sometimes gastrointestinal signs as well can be seen. Certainly, if you have had known exposure to an infected bird and you have any of those signs, we would like you to talk to your physician about getting tested for avian influenza. And that process can be facilitated through the public health unit, has all the information on how to submit those samples to the Public Health Ontario lab.
And have we seen any signs in any other species from poultry or humans, to our knowledge?
So I can speak on the non-bird wildlife. So there have been rare reports in red foxes in Europe, and those red foxes have presented with neurological signs, so very similar to what we're seeing in a lot of our wild bird species. So it's extremely rare, and oftentimes when you get a neurological red fox, we would want to have a look at it anyways, because rabies virus would be much higher on our list for that, but in rare cases, avian influenza can infect them as well.
Okay. And Brian, any other songbirds? Like what other sorts of birds have you guys been seeing come in?
So we haven't had any positive cases in songbirds in Ontario yet. We have been testing every bird that comes through the lab. But going back to Europe, because they've been dealing with this virus for much longer than we have, they have had rare cases in songbirds. So they have had occasional positive sparrows, starlings, and other songbirds as well. So it's definitely not as common in those species, but it has been reported in Europe.
So when someone sends in results, I guess through their veterinarian perhaps, how long do those results take before we get them back? And then a combined question around municipal pounds who may take in stray hens, parrots, etc. Should those birds be tested before rehoming? And is rehoming even allowed of these animals at this point in time?
So as far I can answer the how long the testing takes. So if you have a sample that gets to your veterinarian, once the veterinarian sends it into the animal health lab, once it arrives in our lab, it can take 24 to 48 hours, depending on when that swab lands here. So if it gets here later on say a Monday afternoon, we would run it on Tuesday, and you would most likely have your results by Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. But that is when the swab gets here. So there's going to be a lag time from when your veterinarian sends it into the lab.
Okay.
I'll take one about the pounds and whatnot. So that's an interesting one also, because we ran into this issue with rehab centers for wild birds also. So what is the risk? Well, the risk is if you bring in say you bring in a stray hen and it tests positive for AI, and then say it dies in your care. If you have any other birds in that pound or that facility, they will be considered, your premise will be considered infected. So that, it starts a whole thing based on what, do you have quarantine for that animal? Do you not? If it's if it's domestic poultry, then Greg, you're like, this would become something that CFIA would be involved with, correct?
Sorry, I was typing the answer to one of the other questions because I thought we were off the hook on that one, but
yeah.
Sorry, what was that, Al?
Well, it's more about a question of if domestic poultry come into a pound or a facility or a rehab center or say OSPCA, right, and to because we have hens that are ranging sometimes in urban centers or wherever. If there's a risk to AI and say that bird tests positive, then you guys would be involved in that facility and looking at if it's domestic poultry, correct, or even a pet bird.
For sure. If there's positive results of avian influenza within poultry, then we do look at the premise as a whole, and then all of movements all in and out.
Yeah. So for the wild bird
poultry.
side, yeah, for poultry. So we looked at like on the wild bird side, wild birds aren't considered poultry, but in the rehab center they talked about things like quarantine and quarantine facilities and whether that quarantine would pass to protect the rest of the birds. But yeah, I guess for a pound, yeah, then you would treat that just like any other operation.
Yeah, we treat it like a small flock, or if there was poultry on site, we would treat it like anywhere else that had poultry. The controls would be put in place for poultry on the site, nothing else, and then we would move from there, same as we would like a small flock.
Al, is there any restrictions on rehoming poultry?
Oh my gosh, well, I guess, I don't know, Luci, do you have any thoughts on that? I can't say that we would try and restrict rehoming at this point, but we're like I said, we're kind of in a poultry lockdown right now, try and control the spread of this potential spread of the disease.
And then keep your mind about the 30 days of keeping them separate, quarantine if you would do that. But it is, based on the order that we have, it is prohibited. So
It is, okay. So here's a question just about some of the scalability of the biosecurity practices that we see on commercial farms. Is there any resource that would outline the most appropriate ways to prevent transmission of AI from wild and free range birds to commercial farms? I might have muddled that up, sorry.
So this is going to be a tough one. So Greg and I and Brian are speaking to the Ecological Farmers of Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, which are a lot of the organic folks and some of the free rangers and whatnot. And they're not going to like our message tomorrow, to be honest. Like, we're going to be talking about keeping birds inside for as long as possible before migration ends. We don't know much about this disease. It's a bit of it's a new one for North America. We have a naive population of birds that are being impacted both wild and commercial. So, the information we have for commercial farms is readily available. If you can try and make that work on your own farm or backyard farm, all the power to it. And I'll even throw in your the urban poultry course that we do with Poultry Industry Council. Like there's some really good information on there too.
Mm-hmm.
I like the question about how long is this going to go on till, and I get this, when's the end date? I'm going to throw out February 30th, the date that we know this is going to end, because February 30th doesn't exist. So it's a bit of a tough one to get around, because we can look at our human health and the pandemic and looking at how we thought COVID was only going to be around for 2 weeks and we'd be okay. So it's hard I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but this might be around for a while.
And we're not taking that as giving you bad news, but we're looking for what happens in Europe. And this virus showed up somewhere in spring 2021, and it went over through the summer, and also got another episode started October, November. So they didn't have a break in the summertime, and it's quite aggressive, and it may become endemic because it is the environment that gets contaminated. Yes, wild birds, they will migrate north, but we'll have some resident birds that they are going to remain on the ground. They will continue to shed the virus. So we hope we are not right from the bottom of our hearts, but the way it looks like elsewhere, it's going to stay for a longer time. So.
And I think I'm just looking at that question again about most appropriate ways to prevent transmission. I'm wondering if that's a question about should we be taking down bird feeders or whatnot. Like anything you can do to deter wild bird from your place is going to be of value. So deterring of migratory birds, deterring of the domestic species, or the native species we have in Ontario. So don't draw them to you. One of the other things I'm going to really have to stress and discuss, and I think I did this a couple nights ago, was depending on how you deal with your dead stock. We see this disease in raptors and scavengers. So if you're not dealing with your dead stock properly, whether you're a commercial operation or a small flock operation, you could potentially just be bringing the disease to you by improperly managing your dead stock, because natural disappearance is not an acceptable way to deal with your dead stock, and that might be a great way to get the rest of your flock sick.
So we just have one more question here. Unless anyone has any others, feel free to pop them in. Now's your chance. Just a question about cats becoming infected with H1N1 in past outbreaks, but not really hearing much about that right now. Because that could be a concern if you've got cats commingling in barns and things like that.
I think Dale's comment is more that, yeah, we have seen felines infected with H5N1 or H. So that becomes an issue. but yeah, it's once again, it's almost a public health and One Health issue to watch out for. So I guess all I can say at this point is stay tuned.
Yeah, and I would say from a public health perspective, because I noticed there's a second follow-up question about that, about infection to humans, and yes, that absolutely is a concern. And I certainly would, I'm going to throw it out there that you shouldn't be feeding raw poultry meat or have access to dead stock for your cats or dogs. I think that that's just wise at this point. Don't take the risk. It's not worth it.
Right. So could we just kind of clarify at this point in time, are you able to buy and sell chicks? How does that interact with the order that's happening?
That's a really complicated question. So ultimately it depends on where you are. There is restrictions on bringing live birds into the infected zones of the primary control zones. Hatcheries are able to move birds outside of the primary control zones, including the infected zone, with a specific permit. That specific permit comes with surveillance requirements, biosecurity requirements. So ultimately, you know, the answer is where you are, and the importance to look yourself up in the map in terms of if you're bringing poultry into the zones requires a permit, but prohibited within the infected.
Yeah. And I guess if you're outside of those zones and you're wondering about that, it just is a question of risk, right? So if you're not commingling, but are you really willing to bring potential disease onto your farm? Or be the cause for someone else to spread disease if you're peddling chicks too.
Right. Brian, is there any incidents that you've seen with pheasants being infected in Ontario?
So we haven't seen it in any species other than waterfowl and raptors at this point. We don't get very many pheasants in general. So we have not seen any cases as of now.
Okay.
And I'm assuming this question was about farmed pheasants too. That might be. I don't think.
There's a farm in Texas that's been diagnosed as 1,600 poultry pheasant flock.
Yeah.
That's been diagnosed positive in Texas.
Okay. Is the mortality rate the same for all birds, or is poultry a higher risk for death?
Is it same problem? Well, so I guess if we go back to how this disease spreads, this disease has been post-adapted to waterfowl. So in past influenza outbreaks, we weren't seeing mortality in waterfowl, whether that was wild ducks or commercial ducks. We're seeing mortality. Like farm ducks, we've had a few cases of farm ducks that have gone positive. Brian has mentioned we're seeing it in everything from Canada geese to ducks, various ducks. Turkeys seem to be especially sensitive. We always seem to get a turkey farm come up positive first. So yeah, this disease does not discriminate.
As far as we know, can the disease pass to fertile eggs? And so should those fertilized eggs still be safe to sell?
So again, the movement, if we're talking about movements of hatching eggs and eggs within the zone, it is done under permitting. Even though the egg themselves is not the spread of the disease, it's the movements related to the eggs that we control. So if you're in the zone or if you're in then we control those movements based on the spread of and the risk of the spread of the disease by the movements themselves, not by the egg.
Okay. So there's a question about zoos with exotic species. Is there any information about the susceptibility of various exotic species? And where can we find more information about that?
So Dale, the one who asked the question, she actually was the pathologist, or sorry, she was professor at OVC, so she's not as much asking the question, but stating there's just not a lot of information for exotics, and I think that, to her point, that's why our zoos are that concerned about keeping their collections safe, right? Like this is, we've never seen something like this before, and you know, between some of the bigger zoos like Metro Toronto Zoo, African Lion Safari are very concerned about how they keep some of these collections that include endangered species safe from this disease. So yeah, will there be more information? I really hope so.
Vigilance is the key, is what I'm hearing. Can we just talk a little more about the risk for dogs who might be going into ponds where geese and ducks are circulating?
So I guess the question is, well, is your dog at risk? I'd say if you have poultry, they're definitely at risk. You would not want to, and you know, on the commercial side, we don't want people taking their dogs into the barn. You know, is your dog at risk? I'll leave that one up to one of our veterinarians.
Anyone want to comment on dogs and risk? All right. So we just had a further follow-up from Dale saying the American Association of Zoos, Veterinarians, and European Association are trying to correlate a bit more information on that topic. So hopefully we can look up some resources there and make them available. Is it the retailer's responsibility when selling chicks to check the map where a customer lives to see if they're in an infected zone and refuse sale if we do live close to a confirmed case but not part of the zone? So how is the purchase and the transport being regulated at the retail?
I think that's a great question.
You're in the hot seat tonight, Greg.
Yes.
You're on mute.
Ultimately here, really, it does come down to the person transporting the chicks once they buy. We can certainly are in the process of confirming people to make them aware, and all of us as partners are doing our part to make people aware of the requirements. But ultimately it comes down to, if you buy and you are the one transporting that live bird, at that point a chick, it's prohibited in the infected, and it's your responsibility in terms of the permitting on the other side. So yes, communication is very important for those people selling. Ultimately, the responsibility of the person buying to know where they sit in the zone and know what applies to them.
That's great. And I know a message that we've been talking about throughout this conversation on these webinars is that it's really important to share this webinar series, the information we have posted, with your colleagues. Sometimes they're just not aware of these things, and the best thing you can do is provide them information or access to 1-800 numbers. So lots of information out there. Another question just popped in. If water can be contaminated for 30 days after the introduction of the virus, should there be an advisory for using UV treatment on private water systems that utilize surface water for watering birds, assuming that municipal water treatment of surface water sources should kill the virus? Not sure who.
Well, I'll take a crack at that one. So if you're using surface water for your house or anything, you should be treating it regardless, right? Like surface water, pretty much like a shallow well, a dug well, or surface water. You need to have filtration and sanitation of some sort. This disease or this virus isn't that difficult to kill with disinfectants. Municipal water system should not have any concern about this because they do treat and chlorinate their water system. But if you're on a private well system, even a drilled well can be an issue if you actually have surface water runoff into the well, right? So that goes back to making sure your well's in good shape, and that if you know you're using a shallow well or a dug well, to have filtration and a disinfectant system with your water. If you won't drink the water, you shouldn't be giving it to your birds.
So any recommendations when you're filling waters with a hose?
With like I'm assuming from the garden hose.
The hose.
So yeah, yes. Well, just let it run to clear it out of any stagnant water before you start filling your waters with that. Also, just as an aside, like your water should be clean on a fairly regular basis, also for any biofilms
So
or manure or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say an example. I live in an old farmhouse. The tap water in my house goes through the filtration system, but my outdoor hoses don't go through anything. So it smells like sulfur. It probably turns yellow eventually. So maybe, is there any kind of recommendations you can make around that? Or should a filtration system be used perhaps?
I think as long as the water is clean, and when I mean clean from biologicals, then there shouldn't be an issue. If you have really bad sulfur water, then your birds won't drink it anyways, right? So
right.
we run into the situation down in Niagara Peninsula where we have lots of water, but it's just all sulfur. Then they put it in the pond, the bubbling aeration ponds, and then they use that to water the livestock or poultry, and that's definitely a concern. But in the grand scheme of things, yeah, clean water is the best water.
Correct. So question about where the updated map is that shows the infected zones in Ontario. And I think we've been popping some links into the chat.
Yep.
The Poultry Industry Council website, poultryindustrycouncil.ca, we have the links, but Greg, what kinds of information can we get on that page?
Sure, the question's gone, but ultimately, yeah, on our website, I could drop it into the comments. I'll drop the actual link to the actual maps directly in, so you don't have to search around. But
okay, actually, I think Charlotte's got you covered here.
Oh, does she? She always does. She's always quicker than me.
I just want to make one comment for some of the folks that are on from the game bird side and that are doing some game bird production. We do have, in some of the previous discussions we had, we did do a fair bit of wild bird discussion. So you can go into some of the previous recordings we did, essentially almost back to March 30th, or March 10th that we started this this series. So, but if you have other questions, feel free to come back next week.
Yep. And I don't see any further questions now, so maybe we'll call it a day. We are sending out emails about upcoming sessions. We're sort of thinking about maybe Thursday, but definitely next Tuesday, we're going to be having another session. So make sure you subscribe to that special small flock e-blast. But until then, thank you very much for spending your Tuesday evening with us. We're all here working long days to make sure that we're doing the best we can in managing this situation. If there's any other resources or questions you have, any one of us on the line here are happy to answer them. So thank you. The recording will be up hopefully tomorrow, if not the next day.